Dr. Forshaw, welcome to the Astroben podcast. To kick things off, could you give us an overview of Astroscale's mission and how it aligns with the response development of space for future generations?
Sure, no problem. Thanks a lot, Ben. Very pleased to be here on this podcast. Just give you a bit of information about Astroscale. So, Astroscale's vision is the safe and sustainable development of space for the benefit of future generations. And we're a company that's effectively developing services to clean up space. There's a lot of space junk or space debris up there at the moment. And the function of our company is to firstly develop services that can clean up that, but start looking into future emerging markets. So there's a lot of future markets in the area of what we call in-orbit servicing. So it's actually going up into space and servicing or maintaining spacecraft. And of course, removing failed satellites is one of those services. So I think that's a bit about what we do.
Yeah, I like I've been a fan of Astroscale for a while, and I like the whole kind of where space sweepers, so just simple concept. Everyone understands what rubbish collection is, and it's the same thing. As you say, Astroscale has made significant strides in on orbit servicing. Can you delve into some of the key innovations that has set Astroscale apart in terms of
Mm.
the sustainable space junk
Yeah,
industry?
so the premise we work on really is launching satellites into space to actually rendezvous with this space junk. And what we do, we actually collect it, so we grab hold of it, and then we actually bring it back down to Earth and drop it off, and then it burns up in the atmosphere, thus disposing of it. Um, so, in order to do this, we have to actually rendezvous with the space junk in space. So that means approaching from a very long range away, getting closer and closer, and then eventually docking with the space junk. And that in space is an incredibly complex process. So I think there's been a lot of robotics developments in space. There have been other attempts at rendezvous in the past, but a lot of these have been very big governmental programs. Hundreds of millions or billions have been invested into this. And the reality is we need to make this more commercial. We need to bring the price points lower. We need to get it to a point where we can launch these services and repeatedly remove or service future spacecraft for lower price points. And hopefully, our ambition is by around 2030, in the next several years, that this becomes a regular thing as opposed to having just one-off missions to do this or that just to test things, that this will become the future of space, really, these types of servicing activities.
And sustainability is such a hot topic at the moment worldwide. How how has it changed in the last decade when it comes to space and sustainability? Because you see companies like SpaceX launching thousands of Starlink satellites into low Earth orbit, um, and similarly to what we're experiencing in our oceans, there's people who are sort of you know pointing out that this could potentially be a problem. How is sustainability sort of built into the missions and the launch manifests of companies, and how has that sort of changed over the last decade?
Sure, I think what we're seeing generally over the last maybe 20, 30 years is a shift from a lot of governmental missions where, hundreds of millions or billions have been invested by governments to, of course, now more commercial space companies taking over. And as you just said, there's lots and lots of new large constellations that are going to be launching. There's estimates of tens of thousands of satellites that are going to be launched in the next 10 years. And this is a considerable threat to the space environment. Um, I think that, as you said, there are parallels with sustainability efforts on Earth. I think people are realizing the effects of climate change, global warming, etc. People realizing how much plastic there are in our oceans. I think this great Pacific garbage patch, I think it's called, where there's a huge mounting mass of plastic and all sorts of leftover materials being dumped in the ocean is a growing issue. And I think there's a realization now that space is part of our global environment. So space has about 11,000 tons of debris up there at the moment. There's a couple of thousand satellites which are presently failed. There are millions of fragments of plastic, glass, metal floating through space. And I mean, just to give you a parallel, if you're walking down the street and somebody just threw some rubbish on the floor, you would say, look, what are you doing? But of course, in space, people can do this all the time. Nobody's really regulating that, monitoring that, and that is a real issue for the future. And the reality is that space is part of our global environment, and if we don't keep this clean, we're going to have major issues in the future, and that could mean loss of access to services and things that people use every day. I think people don't realize how much goes through space. You have GPS, your phones, your TV, your financial transactions, weather monitoring, disaster prediction, financial transactions, all these things go through satellites, and people are reliant on them every day in their lives, even if they don't think about that. So it's a real issue, and it's something that's got to be dealt with.
Yeah, it's to look at the parallels. It's kind of no one, well, the majority of the public don't spend much time thinking about the trash in the ocean. But if one day they were told they can't eat fish anymore, then it would become a big issue, right? It's the same like if if the internet went down and you had no phone signal because of an incident in low Earth orbit, suddenly a lot of people would be paying attention. And you talk about sort of different size space junk. The bigger satellites, it kind of makes sense that they're easier to locate. But what about the fragments? Do Astroscale deal with smaller items? And how does that differ?
Yeah, actually, it's a lot of the fragments that cause the issue in the first place. It's the issue, the real issue is what we call lethal non-trackable debris. So these are the small fragments that you can't track easily, and they puncture through your satellite and effectively knock out or destroy your whole satellite, or even fragment it. We actually at Astroscale go after the larger debris because that is clearly owned by somebody. We can create commercial or government contracts to remove that debris. And of course, by removing the larger debris, you're preventing it from colliding and breaking down into those smaller fragments. The issue with the smaller fragments is, firstly, ownership, so there's a legal side. So, if you were to find a piece of glass, or metal, well, I mean, in space, it could be anywhere on Earth, right? How would you know who owned that? And that's so, effectively moving somebody else's property that you didn't know who owned it. That could be a problem. But the reality is as well that there's technical issues actually capturing or removing small debris. As far as I know, there's no real feasible solutions for that. There's been a lot of talk about using lasers to deflect small debris, things like that, but it requires huge amounts of power. It's extremely expensive. They're still very hard to track. So it's extremely complicated. So, that's the next best thing we're doing is removing these larger pieces of debris before they can break up. So I think that's the best feasible solution at present.
And do new missions and new satellites that are launched into orbit today, do they have a full life plan? Do they have an end of life plan built into their mission? And what sort of plans are they? Are they collaborations with companies like Astroscale, or are they sort of up in the air and well, literally, but they sort of keep it open until 20 years down the line?
Mm. Well, almost every satellite that gets launched, and it depends on where you actually launch it from and who owns the satellite. But normally you go through a licensing process. In order to get a license for a satellite, you actually have to tell your government exactly what your satellite mission is, what it's doing. And normally as part of that, there is, well, they say an end of life disposal plan. So many satellite operators plan these days to actually deorbit their satellites. And there's been a lot of regulation on this recently. And previously, there was some guidance that you needed to remove your satellites roughly 25 years. after end of life. This has now dropped to about 5 years in many areas. Of course, it is still guidance in many places, not actually law. So that has caused many satellite constellation providers to lower their altitudes to actually meet this demand. However, the actual need for debris removal services, it's something that people have been starting to talk about. For example, the FCC has said for one of the constellations, for example, that they can only have 2 failures per year. If they go above that, they might need other solutions, such as debris removal. So there's nothing at present mandating people to use these, as we call them, active debris removal services, as in services to get rid of their failed satellites. But I think there is a strong regulatory drive towards that. One of the key things, though, is actually there's a lot of regulation that's starting to appear to push people towards what are known as prepared interfaces. Now, we have a product called the docking plate, which is something we're trying to encourage. We're trying to encourage those satellite manufacturers to put on their satellites. And it's a simple interface that enables docking to that satellite. So if their satellite does fail in future, it can easily be removed. So there's more and more regulation and policy starting to talk about satellites being prepared for removal, so they at least have the mechanism to be easily removed. A parallel on Earth would be, imagine your car having a tow hook on your car or something like that, or other devices that if your car fails, it can easily be removed, things like that. So that's kind of the parallel. But yeah, it's a growing area, I would say, and more and more constellation satellite providers are realizing that it's going to become more important for sustainability to start preparing their satellites to be removed, and understanding that no matter how reliable your satellite is, there's a set percentage that your satellite could still fail and still need removal in future through one of these type of services.
No, that's fascinating, and I'll put details on the docking plate in the show notes. And what other uses are there of this docking plate? Like, could you use it for servicing, refueling if it's that sort of satellite? What are the various uses of the docking plate, and what are the sort of key benefits?
So there's a range of different types of interfaces you can put on satellites. Our docking plate is a more simple one because sometimes simpler is better, less likely to fail. But it's effectively a metal plate that has a magnetic docking ring at the top. And you can effectively dock to that using our magnetic technologies, but you can also grapple to it using a robotic arm. But because this enables docking in any form, it's very useful for a lot of future applications. So to give you some examples, satellite upgrading is one. There's a lot of customers which are now saying, instead of satellites being a throwaway asset, you launch them once, you get rid of them after the end of life. Why don't we create satellites that you can upgrade? So, you launch them once, but then after a while you send up a servicing vehicle. It can pull out the old payload and put in the new payload. So for example, upgrade the processor, your computer, maybe upgrade the payload, whatever it's doing, to a more modern version. So there's talk of these as well. So there's upgrading, as you say, refueling. Refueling does, of course, require a special interface where you could transfer the fluids from one satellite to another, which the docking plate can't do, but it's more for docking. You could still dock to the satellite and then refuel it using another interface. But the future also holds things such as satellite assembly, so building together complex structures in space. So there are some telescopes that are being planned in the future, and you'll launch them up in separate parts. And then in space, you'll have a vehicle that actually physically puts them together like Lego in space. So I think that's the future. There's a lot of brighter opportunities up there in space, and you watch a lot of these sci-fi films. And, that's using a lot of the technologies that you see there in the future, really. That's based on having the capabilities of doing servicing, I guess.
Fascinating. And obviously, anything you do in space, well, if you're trying to address sustainability initiatives in space, it has to be an international effort because, if you have one clear area of low Earth orbit and the rest is full of junk, it's not going to be particularly beneficial to humanity. Astroscale has a global presence. You've got subsidiaries in Japan, the UK, the US, and Israel. How do these international collaborations contribute to these efforts, and why those locations?
Mm. So I think there's if you take a look at a list of who puts a lot of the junk in space, it's probably not good at this present point to point fingers and say, "Oh, you created debris, you've got to clear it up." What we need now are governments that are interested in clearing up their space debris and taking actions towards that, really. And those are the countries we've really started with. So if you take a look at Japan, JAXA at the moment is starting to fund for us a mission called Address J that launches later this year. And that actually is going to inspect a large existing rocket that's been left in space. And eventually that will lead to its removal. You have in the UK a mission we have called Cosmic, which is actually going to remove two UK owned pieces of debris. You have the European Space Agency that has said by 2030 they're committed to cleaning up any satellite that might have failed. In the US, there's something called the US Orbits Act, which is actually looking at funding missions to remove US debris. So if you take a look at it from this perspective, you have countries now that have a common interest. So US, UK, Japan, ESA, etc., that are all saying, look, we want to start clearing up our own debris. So that's how it starts. And then, of course, you have more and more countries that join in later on and say, look, we realize this is a problem. We're going to put funding towards that. And that, of course, is how you grow. You go to these other countries. Our next one, of course, is France. We only just last month, we opened up a new French office, and that's also looking at debris removal and a range of different services. But again, the French government and CNES, which is the French Space Agency, has said, look, we want to start clearing up some of the French debris. So again, that explains some of the locations and also who has an interest right now in clearing up that debris.
Mm. And we should probably talk about your position. So you're the head of future business in Europe. So you're likely well versed in the European space landscape. Um, how does what's the plan for Astroscale in Europe? You mentioned a few locations there. Is it sort of a partnership with ESA? Is that a sort of main focus that you're working on, and the UK Space Agency?
Sure, yeah. So I think there's a couple of missions to mention. The first is LSRM. So M stands for multi removal, effectively. And this is a mission that we're launching in about 2025 to actually go and commercially start clearing up some of this debris. And we've been working with ESA, the European Space Agency, and a constellation provider called OneWeb, which is one of the world's largest constellation providers. And we've been working together for about 5 years to design a servicing vehicle that can actually go up and remove some of this debris. So in 2025, there's going to be a mission to actually service one of these OneWeb satellites, which will be one of the world's first demonstrations of commercial debris removal. So that's fantastic. And from that, I mentioned briefly before that we've been developing this Cosmic mission. Now, Cosmic is a variant of that mission that will have a robotic arm, and it will be able to capture debris in space that hasn't been prepared in any way. And we're looking at capturing two small UK-owned assets. Now, these failed satellites were launched in around the 1990s. So they've been in space about 30 years. And of course, the UK government has now said, look, wouldn't it be wonderful if we can get rid of these satellites? So, they've been up there. They were pioneering at their time. They've done their job, but of course, their life is finished. They're just floating about in space. And the next stage of their life is to be removed, really. So that's what we're looking at in Cosmic. So yeah, as you say, there's a lot of work with the UK Space Agency, with commercial customers such as OneWeb, with the European Space Agency. So it's very thriving in the UK. We just moved into a new office, Zeus. Has a large clean room. It has a new operations room. We have about 170 staff now. So in the last few years, we've grown significantly. I was one of the starting members back in 2017. There were only four of us at the time, and we started in a small little office in Harwell. And as we got more staff, we grew more and more offices, and it's now fantastic to actually move into your own kind of UK kind of headquarters, which is a large building with clean room and everything. So it shows our growth and all of the turbulent times we've had through COVID and all of those difficulties in the last 5 years. But we've overcome them all, and we've grown quite successfully over these last several years. So
You absolutely have. The space debris issue has got a lot of media attention in recent years. What's your or Astroscale's perspective on the role of leadership in driving change and encouraging responsible behaviour? Because as a service provider, there's only so much say you have over sort of government's space programs. Does the company spend much time sort of lobbying for more sustainable practices?
mm, yeah, absolutely. One of our key areas of our business is on policy. So we understand that in order to offer these types of future services, it's not just about developing the technology and about maturing the business case, getting investment for all these things, but policy is one of the most important areas. So it's about driving regulation, driving countries, governments, other policy working groups towards more sustainable areas. So there's many different policy groups these days. One is called CONFERS, CONFERS. That's one of the global industry groups for in-orbit servicing. We chair that one. There's the Space Safety Coalition. The World Economic Forum has a lot of things in this. We're invited at one point to the G7 to talk on some of these things. So UN COPUS is another. That's the UN body for the peaceful cooperation of outer space. So they also create some of the rules for what you can and can't do in space. So we're part of all of these different groups and trying to feed in input to influence governments and also the public, and not just influence, but to educate, to try and make governments and the public understand better how important space is, and why we really need to work towards global space sustainability, and kind of the impacts of what happens if we don't get there, really,
Mm.
if we don't start offering these services.
This is probably going to sound like a really silly question, but if there was an instance where, say, two big satellites, you know, I don't know, I don't know, maybe, I don't know, two big satellites in low Earth orbit were on collision for each other. Is there a sort of almost planetary defense uh, protocol to prevent space junk? Like, would it be companies like Astroscale that would be asked to predict what would happen if two satellites crashed into each other? And how does that sort of link into, because I imagine, well, I know there's a lot of companies who are sort of doing observation and tracking these satellites, but what's the process of, okay, these satellites are definitely going to crash into each other, this is going to be the impact? Do Astroscale have any say in that as to what the solution could be?
Yeah, so it might interest you to know that there have been satellite collisions in the past. In 2009, the Iridium 33 and the Cosmos 2251 satellite actually collided in space, and they're traveling at speeds of 26,000 miles an hour. I think that's about 20 times the speed of a bullet. You can imagine what happened to the satellites. They completely obliterated and formed thousands of fragments of debris. So, we're seeing collisions like that in space. We're seeing a lot of near misses and things like that. a lot of satellites these days have propulsion on board. So that means that if a collision is about to happen, they'll be informed. There's various collision alert services, so they get a message saying your satellite's going to hit XYZ in X number of hours. You should move. Okay, so because of the number of satellites being launched, some of these providers like Starlink or others are getting, thousands of these alerts, every day. They're starting to really, really ramp up. And the question is, can you actually move for all of them? How many of them are credible? Because the information is not always very accurate. So I think in many cases, satellites can move in case of collision. However, you have a lot of satellites as well that don't have propulsion. A lot of the older satellites don't have propulsion. If your satellite fails, it can't move. If your satellite fragments into thousands of bits of metal and plastic, obviously those items can't move as well. So whoever has the propulsion capability on board is the party that has to move. And if both parties can't move, then you've got a problem. You're going to have a collision. And then I guess there's legal ramifications of that. But yeah, if you just have two defunct satellites that are going to collide, often you might not know about that until a number of hours, or it could be a day or sometimes 2 days ahead of when that happens. Sometimes it wouldn't be possible to launch a satellite quickly enough to get there to move one of them out of the way. So it's quite difficult to do that. However, it's about predicting in future which orbits are more congested, which orbits are more likely to have accidents, to have more fragments in. And so if you have a satellite that's failed in one of those orbits where you're more likely to have a collision, then it probably makes sense you employing a service such as Astroscale service to go up and actually remove you before something bad does happen, really. So, yeah.
Interesting. So, thinking of the future, what's your personal vision for the future of humanity in space? I don't know if you're a. It sounds like you're probably a sci-fi fan, are most people in the industry. But what's your kind of prediction and best hopes for where the next couple of decades go? Do you think we'll go to the moon, onto Mars? Can you imagine us living in low Earth orbit, hotels in space, that kind of thing?
I think going to the moon and the Mars is certainly possible. I think it would be quite hard to live on Mars. I mean, naturally, the biggest concern on getting there and living there is radiation. So, over time, it may not be survivable unless we develop ways to stop that radiation, I guess. Um, I would hope that in the next 10 plus years, we would have a thriving, as they say, in orbit servicing or on orbit servicing ecosystem where you do have lots of satellites going into space to repair satellites, to service them, to refuel them, all these different types of opportunities. There's a number of things that are being developed on the lunar side now. So infrastructure that exists around the moon. To actually do things, and part of that are elements that might need refueling or moving about in space. So I can imagine in the next 10, 20 years you'll see some of these activities starting to happen. So I think there's a bright future out there, and I think that there is a future in space for humanity. But yeah, really look forward to seeing where that's going.
And hopefully a sustainable one.
Mm.
Just as a final thought, for me, if someone says what space-based companies are into sustainability, Astroscale is nearly always one of the top ones. So given their record and future aspirations, what message would you like to convey to any listeners who are interested in responsible and sustainable development of space?
I would encourage people to start taking an interest in the whole space debris area, realizing the threat that space debris has the potential to cause. One of the things I keep looking at is the ESA space debris statistics page. You can just access if you type that on Google, and you'll see, day by day, month by month, the number of failed satellites in space increasing, the number of predicted satellites to be launched going up and up. And I would just say that the awareness is probably the most important thing. Just understanding really that space is part of our ecosystem. And I know, of course, on Earth is very, very important. Our rainforests, our oceans as well. But I think it just has to be a wider awareness that space as well, although people think, oh, there's nothing up there, it's just space, literally. It is part of our global ecosystem. And I think it has to be treated as such. And just being aware of that full stop, um, I think it's important enough that in future there'll be a lot of topics around this area, and yeah, people will realize the damage we've been doing to space over the years and how important it is to have this global, sustainable space environment.
Absolutely. Dr. Jason Forshaw, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.